Good morning, everyone. I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair here at the Hudson Institute, and it's a great privilege to open up this conversation with such a distinguished panel of experts from the United States and South Korea. We're here to focus on one big topic, North Korean strategy. I chose that simple title because Kim Jong Un surely has one, and as Sun's Art of War reminds us, victory in the life and death business of war begins long before the first shot is fired. It begins with estimation. Ji Li Shi, calculating advantage to create momentum, is sort of the science of the art of war. Every American has a stake in understanding this adversary. From the sacrifices of the Korean War to today's nuclear era, North Korea remains a persistent challenge to peace. It now wields nuclear weapons capable of striking not only our allies, but our own cities, our homeland. It's tightening its alignment with Russia, renewing its partnership with China, conspiring with Iran, and exploiting our shared cyberspace, stealing secrets, siphoning billions in cryptocurrency, and using artificial intelligence to disguise operatives as remote IT workers inside our own firms. Yet North Korea's ultimate objectives remain largely unchanged: to survive, to command prestige, and to perpetuate the Kim dynasty. Its methods are ruthless and deceptive: draconian political control, nuclear and asymmetric coercion, great power manipulation, and illicit finance. This could change if President Trump and Kim Jong Un resume summit diplomacy, maybe in a couple weeks. Kim has in recent years, however, turned his back on dialogue with Washington and Seoul, branding us the principal enemy. He has signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with Moscow and revived high-level ties with Beijing. The question before us is not only what Pyongyang intends, but how the United States and South Korea and others should respond to a strategy waged across battlefields, both physical and digital, diplomatic and military. We're fortunate to enjoy a strong alliance with South Korea, its strength clearly on display with President Trump and Lee Jae-myung at the White House just a couple weeks ago. Now, Kim Jong Un, this past month or so, has been returning to big power diplomacy in a big way, burnishing at the same time his nuclear arsenal. He appears to be studying, if not fully mastering, the art of gray zone warfare in the 21st century. We must be equally vigilant and agile, calculating advantage, building momentum, and shaping the peace before any conflict begins. So, to get right into it, to help us stay strategically focused, agile, resilient amid upheaval, I'm honored to welcome this outstanding panel of experts. Lieutenant General Chun is a retired Republic of Korea Army officer. He's a highly decorated general with 38 years in uniform. He led combat units from platoon through division level, served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and finished as commanding general of the ROK Special Forces. I should add that when Kim Il-sung was resorting to terrorism in Rangoon, or Kim Jong-il trying to infiltrate South Korea, or Kim Jong-un committing provocations at the DMZ, Chun was the man one called. Marcus Garlauskas, in order. Bruce Klingner is a senior fellow at the Mansfield Foundation. Before that, he was senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation, and a 20-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Among many other things, Bruce led the CIA's Korea branch during the first North Korean nuclear crisis. He's a distinguished National War College graduate, and be careful, he's also a martial arts black belt. So don't disagree with Bruce. Marcus Garlauskas is director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center. Among many great contributions to our nation, Marcus has previously served as the U.S. National Intelligence Officer for North Korea and chief of the Intelligence Estimates Branch in U.S. Forces Korea's Strategy Division. Next, Dr. Tarim Lee is visiting scholar at George Washington University's Institute for Korean Studies. She was a professor of Russian politics at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy and served as policy planning director for the Presidential Committee on Northern Economic Cooperation. She's trained in law with advanced degrees from Moscow State University and the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and her doctorate examined legal issues in sending gas from Russia through North Korea to South Korea. Her recent work focuses on the war in Ukraine, Russia-China relations, and the Russia-North Korea nexus. And finally, Dr. Glenn Chaffetz is director of the 2430 Group, a nonprofit organization that helps private companies, universities, and NGOs defend against intellectual property theft, infrastructure attacks, and disinformation. Glenn brings more than 30 years of experience across government, academia, and the private sector, including multiple overseas tours as a CIA chief of station and service as the Directorate of Operations' first Chief of Tradecraft and Technology. His recent work examines the U.S.-China economic competition and North Korea's cyber-enabled threats. So with that out of the way, we're going to spend now the remaining 55 minutes in discussion. We're going to ask for a few brief framing remarks. I'll come back with a question, and with the time remaining, we'll take a few questions from the audience. But let me begin first with In-beom Chun.
Setting aside the problems that the Republic of Korea, especially the Korean military, is having right now, if I focus on the North Koreans, right now the North Koreans just recently has, again, publicly declared that South Korea is their enemy. It implies that they don't consider us South Koreans no longer Koreans, but an object to be destroyed and eliminated. Secondly, the United States, of course, is the target, and they've showcased a canister that's really, really big. We don't know what's in it, but they sure do have a really big mobile transporter, so they're getting there. Finally, Kim Jong Un. This guy, he's shrewd, he's capable, he's cold-blooded, and he's patient. But most of all, he's lucky. And who would have thought the Russians would attack Ukraine? Who would have thought that he would be able to use this opportunity to his best? Some of my friends tell me that the level of ammunition supplied by North Korea to the Russians equals the amount that the entire free world has supplied to the Ukrainians. Remember when they initially reported that half of the ammunition is not exploding from the North Koreans? Do you know what? I think what they were doing was all the ammunition that they had in storage for 80 years, they expended that. Now they have new ammunition in their storage areas. So it's, no matter how you look at it, it's not a good thing. And so I feel that we face significant challenges. The only hope that I have is K-pop demon hunters. This is not totally a joke.
No.
I think North Korea has really big challenges. Their society is so brittle. I mean, think about it. How can a system like that last this long? They could be at the final stages. And they're so scared of outside information that they've declared that South Korea is an enemy. They don't want anything to do with us, even in a situation now where the South Korean government is trying to do anything, bend over backwards to try to accommodate them. And yet they're so scared of K-pop demon hunters creeping into their society that they can't do that. So I think that's the weak nature of the North Koreans. But even this is not a good situation for us. Because think of it. If North Korea is collapsing in a violent way, it's really bad news for me. And thinking about what happened in Northern Africa, God knows, what the second and third order effects will be. So I think we need to keep an eye on all of this. Praying is not enough, but cooperation between allies is very important. Thank you.
Imran, thank you very much. Bruce, how do you see it?
Yeah, an underlying theme of this conference is, what is North Korea up to? And I think for longtime Korea watchers, and I've been doing it 32 years, we kind of shrug our shoulders and say, well, what North Korea's always been doing. It's like a good basketball player, now Kim Jong Un is weaving and bobbing and pivoting back and forth. So on a tactical level, you may not know which way he's going today, but at a strategic level, you know which direction North Korea is going, because that's the direction they've been going in, since its inception. But the basketball analogy breaks down because really there are 5 or 6 teams on the court, and North Korea changes allegiances amongst them so that they get the maximum benefits, whether it's security, economic, or diplomatic, while minimizing the influence that any of the other teams have on North Korea. But sort of they're driving down the court in a certain way. So I think any of us who've been following it for a while, we could dust off old papers of, North Korean-Chinese relations are strained, and Beijing is angry at North Korea, and then later we can dust off the other papers saying the relations have thawed, they're improving, perhaps they're the strongest they've ever been. And the same with sort of the Soviet Union or Russia. So right now we have, whether it's a trilateral or quadrilateral alliance or partnership or a series of bilateral partnership or friends with benefits or whatever we want to call it, we see the 3 or 4 countries, including Iran, as very strong, especially China, Russia, North Korea. The standing together in the military parade in Beijing showed that a sign of solidarity, a sign of defiance of the Western world, of the sanctions system. And right now, Kim Jong Un is probably feeling that North Korea is perhaps in the strongest position that it's ever been. Because of the invasion of Ukraine, now Russia is very dependent on North Korean military supplies, and some estimates are $20 billion or more that North Korea may have gotten for all the missiles, et cetera. So all of that, the benefits from Russia of food, fuel, funding, and some level of military technology, along with the thawing of relations with Beijing, which is its largest trading partner. North Korea is like, I don't need to run after the United States for benefits like he may have felt he had to in 2018, 2019. He's getting more benefits with fewer conditions from Russia than he could possibly get from the US and South Korea. So now when he's saying, I'm not interested in dialogue with South Korea because he doesn't need South Korea as a mediator or a facilitator of relations with the United States. And with the US, you can sit back and just say, if you want to talk to me, it's on my conditions. We will not talk about denuclearization. Now that has really always been the underlying premise, but oftentimes we talk about denuclearization in some manner. So right now he's feeling he's in the catbird seat. He's in a very strong negotiating position. He's not rushing back to meet with the United States, and he sees that Trump perhaps is more eager for a meeting to get a Nobel Peace Prize or to get some diplomatic victory. So the US is seen as more eager than North Korea. Whether they meet later this month, I think that's a low probability, high impact scenario, but we'll have to see how it plays out.
Marcus, how do you see Kim Jong Un, especially with his nuclear arsenal, and is he posturing for war or is he posturing for diplomacy or both?
Sure, that's a great question, and also I have to apologize for asking for the last minute switch. I wanted to go after Bruce because I saw how well prepared you were to give the overview.
I just printed out more paper.
I didn't have to potentially have some repetition between the two of us. So Bruce made some tremendous points, and I think those are a great question and a place to start. And so before we go on, I think that phrase, North Korea is in the strongest strategic position it's been in decades, was actually put out earlier this year in an unclassified report, I believe, from the Defense Intelligence Agency. And those sorts of things are not said lightly by U.S. intelligence organizations. And so I think we should keep that in mind as a foundational element for this conversation. I'm glad you mentioned it, Bruce. So to pivot to your question, Patrick, the North Koreans, in my view, are always preparing for war as they see themselves in a state of war on a daily basis. And so, but I think the question in some ways, what you're really asking is not so much preparing for the continuation of this war in the gray zone and by asymmetric means, but a transition to an actual full-scale attack. And what I would say is that Kim Jong Un, in my view, intends to achieve his goals without triggering a full-scale conflict. And so my concern, and what I've raised many times, and many of you I think are familiar with my writing and speaking on this topic, is the potential for North Korea to escalate in what we call the gray zone, or what some call the gray zone, in a condition where North Korea, to leverage its military capabilities, its nuclear deterrent, the asymmetric capabilities like and the advances in drone warfare that it's learning about in its involvement in the conflict in Ukraine, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, that it's going to leverage those capabilities and those coercive threats to be able to achieve its goals by going far beyond the sorts of limited provocations it's conducted in the past, like the lethal actions in 2010, the sinking of the warship Chun Un, the shelling of Pyongyang Island, but still staying below the threshold of what would trigger a full-scale war, activate the Combined Forces Command, wartime command and control arrangements, and lead to a counteroffensive that would destroy everything that the regime has tried to build in recent decades. So in that space, there is a real danger, and we can't know exactly what Kim Jong Un's calculus is going to be, and I would suspect even Kim Jong Un himself will not know until the moment comes where he decides now the conditions are right to have the opportunity to launch that sort of limited aggression. And knowing the form it's going to take in advance would be difficult, perhaps even impossible. But that space, dominating that space, my view, is the central element of North Korea's strategy for survival and for achieving dominance of the Korean Peninsula. Not unification. Dominance is something different, achieving a dominant position. He doesn't want to occupy South Korea like the way that Kim Il-sung tried to do in 1950 and try and control a million person population that's been exposed to K-pop demon hunters and that has lived in wealth and prosperity and had freedom. He doesn't want to try and rule that, but he wants to dominate it. He wants to be in a position where he can dictate to the Republic of Korea what its foreign policy connections are going to be, bring an end to the ROK-US alliance, and essentially position himself so that where South Korea is constantly worried about doing something that might upset North Korea to the point where even South Korea is going to self-censor and control its own information to keep from upsetting the Kim family, so that they're again in this thinking about them in this dominant position. And so I think that idea of, are they preparing for war? They're at war today in their minds, a war for the survival of the regime and to achieve a dominant position on the peninsula. And the question is, when, where, and how are they going to escalate to a greater degree of military force, backed by nuclear coercion, backed by great power support, enabled by the tremendous exchange of resources they're having with Russia, the buildup of their defense industrial complex, the improvement in the range and missile evasion capability of defense evasion capability of their missiles, these sorts of things. And so I really, as a closing thought, encourage everyone to think about not just the fact that North Korea is in the strongest strategic position it's been in decades, and that position could be getting stronger, but also remember, simply because the regime's goal is survival does not mean that it's a passive strategy. It achieves its goals, it achieves in its mind, in Kim Jong Un's mind, security through coercion, through aggression, through keeping us off balance, through conducting illicit activities to bring in resources. There's risk involved in that, but for the Kim regime, passivity would lead to destruction. It's aggression, it is coercion, it's illicit a trade. Those are the very things that keep the regime alive. And when you look at it as Americans or South Koreans, we can often say, hey, why are they taking all these risks if they're focused on survival? But that's their mindset, right? And so we have to keep that in mind We may not have the strategy document that Kim Jong Un uses to drive his thinking, and perhaps he's so opportunistic in his mind, his strategy is constantly evolving in nuance. But the basic idea is to be aggressive, forward-leaning.
With him. So how do you think about the prospect of a Trump-Kim resumed summit?
Okay, so I'm afraid I would be the only person to talk about diplomacy. So, well, let me try. So, recent many Korean experts and officials assess that the probability of President Trump and Kim Jong Un has increased. And President Trump repeatedly told that he was willing to meet Kim Jong Un. For his part, Kim recently has sent a conciliatory signal saying that he still has a good memory of Trump. At the same time, Pyongyang revealed the Hwasong 20 ICBM, clearly intended to pressure or remind Washington to return to the negotiating table. So our problem is now that North Korea has already made its condition for dialogue clear, our colleague already said, saying that there is no reason not to sit face to face as long as Washington abandons its illusion of denuclearizations. So from my point of view, there are two key questions in any possible US-North Korea dialogue. First is how urgently Washington views the North Korea issue, and whether it is ready to begin with a more realistic approach focused on arms control or normalization. Given North Korea's strong determination to maintain its nuclear weapons, now many Korean experts argue that we must admit the reality that sanctions have failed to stop North Korea's nuclear program, and that with China and Russia expanding economic cooperation with Pyongyang, the possibility of denuclearization has become even more remote. And what it means is to focus on building an environment in which North Korea feels no need to use nuclear weapons. That will require bold diplomatic thinking, of course, but we should also admit that today's North Korea is not the same North Korea 7 years ago. At the recent event, as we saw in Beijing and Pyongyang projected unprecedented level of confidence and a clear move away from international isolations. So more importantly, North Korea has formed an alliance with Russia. From my point of view, as long as Pyongyang sees Russia as a strategic long-term lifeline, it is quite unlikely Pyongyang make any kind of deal with Washington, which crosses Moscow's interest, I think. So therefore, the second key question is whether Washington and Moscow can find a point of compromise or coordination on the North Korea issue. As seen in various official statements made by Russia for the last year, it appears to have Russia has likely taken an explicitly approving and even supportive stance toward Pyongyang's nuclear armament. At the same time, it is also noteworthy that Moscow, seeking to maintain its positive ties with Trump, has been trying to propose cooperation in various areas. Therefore, it is highly likely to respond positively if asked to support renewed US-North Korea dialogue. And of course, Russia will try to ensure of its own strategic interests reflected in the talk between the US and North Korea. Ultimately, the meeting point between Washington's and Moscow's strategic interests could hold the key to a new formula for the Korean Peninsula, which must combine a new security architecture in East Asia with economic cooperation. For example, joint development of rare earth in North Korea, which are now critical for the United States. Today, the world building confidence may sound naive, but the current reality of North Korea's nuclear program has already proved that there is no other path left to achieve peace. So I'd like to share more of my thoughts on North Korea-Russia relations later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And we'll come back to the other panelists to talk a bit about how Lee Jae-myung is approaching diplomacy, maybe with North Korea, or should, how we're going to modernize the alliance amidst this diplomacy, and how things like the engagement, normalization, and denuclearization being the end goal after all of those others are achieved will fit in. But first, let's pick up in the cyber world with Glenn. Glenn, where do you situate us right now with North Korean activities in cyber-enabled attacks and espionage and spying and cyber theft?
So this is absolutely critical to Kim's survival strategy. The problem with gray zone warfare right now between North Korea and the United States, South Korea, Japan, and other allies is that North Korea is much better at it. And it's much better at it in part because of the cooperation with China and Russia, and because it's asymmetric and it's incremental, and because South Korea, Japan, and the United States are not responding very effectively. So the first part is that part of survival for Kim depends on funding the regime. And some of that funding comes from China and comes from some of the recent deals with Russia, but most of the funding comes from crime. And much of that funding comes from cybercrime. I spend a lot of time talking to tech companies in Silicon Valley, and they all say some version of the following statement. There's two kinds of companies in the United States. Those that know that they have hired North Korean remote IT workers and funded Kim's nuclear and missile programs, and those that have but don't know that they have. This is an absolutely gargantuan problem with tens of thousands that we know of, North Korean IT workers, all working happily for US companies as subcontractors for remote IT services that almost all American companies depend on. We've been made aware of this problem, FBI bulletins. We belong to a roundtable here in New York. We meet with FBI periodically about cyber threats. And I said, great, what are you doing about it? And he said, well, nothing. It's not our job to do anything about it. It's the government's job to do something about it. I said, well, the government's not doing anything about it. He said, well, I mean, we're getting good IT services. Our job isn't national security. Our job is finance. And that's the problem. And Kim knows that, and she knows that, and Putin knows that. And so they cooperate. They wage gray zone warfare, not just with cyber, not just with IT remote services, but with theft, with sabotage, with pulling up fiber optic lines, with disinformation campaigns. I mean, the famous Sony hack. And so what you have is, and I'm stealing from my co-panelists here who did a great job of talking about the overall relationship. What you have is this triumvirate of autocrats who are waging a very sophisticated, very relentless, very intense, extensive gray zone warfare, mainly against our private sectors, also our public sector. And our response is ranges from nothing to inadequate. And I think if we are to have some sort of coherent response to what has become a new, much more dangerous, much more fraught Cold War involving the United States and its allies against China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, we're going to have to develop a new strategy and a new toolkit that involves enlisting our private sector.
I think we have time for a round of questions before we go to the audience here. And I want to just pick up a few of the big themes here, because North Korea has its own interests and fears, as General Chun pointed out. But clearly some of the interest in building these ties with Russia and the longstanding relationship with China means they're not only protecting their own longstanding interests, they can't counter and undermine the interests of Russia and China. So before South Korea and the United States sort of engage in diplomacy and deal with North Korea, they have to take all of that into account. Plus they're using North Korea a broad toolkit that includes everything from cyber to building up the ICBMs that can threaten our homeland and everything in between in the gray zone. So that's a very tall order. So I want to turn to our leaders, President Trump and E. James Young in particular, and sort of how do we advise them as E. James Young wants inter-Korean diplomacy, understandably, wants to improve the relationship that was sort of frozen, but how can he do that practically speaking right now? President Trump wants to be a peacemaker. He's just achieved a big ceasefire in the Middle East. If he's successful on Ukraine, Russia, big if. But nonetheless, he would, I'm sure, love to be able to say, hey, I'm ending the Korean War, perhaps. Who knows where this could be going in terms of starting a new round of summit diplomacy in the second term. These are at least big questions that need to be thought through in advance. So on this sort of strategic diplomatic set of questions, General Chun, what would you recommend?
I would just tell them and acknowledge their political goals and what they want to do as an advisor. But at the same time, I would advocate for a strong security, military readiness, because unfortunately, you can't trust communists. In the old days, we used to have this thing about an 8-loop cycle with the North Koreans. I don't know if Mr. G remembers, but they will create a crisis, they'll start negotiations, they'll prolong the negotiations, they'll demand things that we just can't accept, and then they'll break the negotiations and blame it on us, and then create another crisis, and so on and so forth. Among the many things that has happened to Kim Jong Un during the past 10 plus years, I focus on two things that has happened to him. In his early years in 2016, there was an incident along the Korean border. I assume many of his senior advisors told him, these South Koreans, these Americans, they're pushovers. They'll never, stand up to us. Many of us might not remember, but in 2016, when I was on active duty, the border along the South Korean and North Korean territory, it was the most contentious period since the Korean War. We came this close. So I think Kim Jong Un realized that these South Koreans are crazy. And it was the Park Geun-hye era, very conservative, ultra-conservative government. Then, during the last administration, something happened that we've never seen before. South Koreans actually trying to tempt a military response from the North Koreans. And I think when I said he was shrewd, he had the temperament not to take the bait. So in his mind, I think he thinks the South Koreans are not better than him, but that South Korean governments are crazy. We thought that he was crazy, but I think he thinks we are crazy and therefore untrustworthy. And then he has his own experiences with the United States. So all of this is something that I feel drives his decision cycle. And so for many years, they've come to the conclusion that it's better safe not to deal with the South Koreans or the United States. But we need to learn how to live with a nuclear-armed North Korea. And since we need to do that, I would advocate that a strong military readiness is required for any kind of negotiations to be taken seriously by an entity like North Korea and Kim Jong Un. So that would be my strong advice. And at the moment, we're having discussions and challenges, which oftentimes looks like confusion to a country like North Korea. I hope that they understand that there is strength in the kinds of processes that we go through.
Just as we shouldn't underestimate North Korea has at times underestimated South Korea and the United States. But Bruce, when we're thinking about modernizing the alliance amidst all of this diplomacy, I mean, how do we do that in this context, this political context?
Well, I think, in the medical field, the Hippocratic Oath says first do no harm, and then a variant on that is if you're doing harm, stop it. And I don't think the U.S. is following that advice when it is dealing in its alliance relationships. The U.S. needs its allies and partners in trying to combat the opponents who can militarily attack the American homeland as well as undermine our strategic objectives overseas. The U.S.-ROC alliance is a military relationship, but it's part of the overall broader relationship. And I think you have to look at the tariffs and how that is affecting our relations with our friends and allies. They're capricious, they're protectionist, they're in no way based on other countries' tariffs or non-tariff barriers against us. They're a way of trying to be transactional and make money for the U.S. government. And contrary to numerous assertions, it's the American consumer and businesses that are paying for it. It's not foreign businesses and governments. So our allies see these capricious tariffs as, they're in no way economic in response to tariffs, especially with countries like South Korea, where we have a free trade agreement. What is the U.S. trying to do? Why are we treating our allies in many ways worse than our opponents, such as China, where we keep deferring tariffs against them? So the allies are seen as, why are you punishing us economically and then turn around and make additional security demands? So, they see these demands on the economic side of investment and punitive tariffs, et cetera, and they don't see a dependable U.S. economic partner or a U.S. security partner. I like analogies, and the analogies I see with these tariffs is if you think of an old U.S. Wild West movie where the sheriff is trying to cajole the nervous townspeople to become deputies to go against the very scary opponent down in Deadwood Gulch, but first the sheriff gut shoots his deputies, he steals their wallets, and he says, okay, saddle up, the posse is going against this enemy. And the townspeople are like, why did you do that to us? We're supposed to be your partner, and now you've hurt us before you've hurt the opponent. We're not really wanting to go along with this, or if we're being forced into, there's a lot of questions about our dependability. Now, in the lead up to the Trump-E summit, there was a lot of reporting about the U.S. security demands, greater Korean spending on defense, perhaps a contribution for offsetting some of the costs of the U.S. forces there, modernizing the alliance, refocusing USFK primarily or exclusively towards China, et cetera. That didn't happen. There's some indications that perhaps we have some kind of security agreement, I think on a very vague, broad scale that could have been announced at the summit but couldn't be detached from the overall tariff issue. My concern is that we're making these demands, we're demanding more and we're promising less. And I think our allies are seeing the U.S. as less dependable, and they're wondering how far they need to go to maintain the U.S. protection, whether it's nuclear or conventional. And I just feel there's a lot of nervousness amongst our allies as to how they deter these threats, China and North Korea on their borders or in their region, with a partner that they see as exclusively only focused on its own interests and not more broader interests, including those of the alliances.
It's great. Marcus, when I think about how Seoul and Washington are approaching North Korea, though, there's alignment between, I think, Lee Jae-myung and President Trump to try to engage Kim Jong Un. And let me just give you this focus possibility, which is that if the United States is trying to isolate China as the priority challenge for the United States, then surely it's in our interest to try to back North Korea away from that, Russia away from that, to the extent possible, if it's possible. And so one thing that's often talked about, as you know, is the small deal, say an ICBM moratorium, launch moratorium, a nuclear test moratorium, sort of go back and replay the, in 2018. How do you assess that strategically, that kind of thinking?
So I think the place to begin is to recognize this phrase that we mentioned earlier about North Korea being in the strongest position that it's been in decades. And so the question is, what sort of deal could we get out of the North Koreans that wouldn't require making unacceptable concessions on our part? So I think we should remain open to the idea of some sort of a negotiated deal with the North Koreans that would benefit South Korea and the United States, but not go into it with irrational optimism about how likely that possibility is, again, given the position that North Korea is in. So much stronger position that they are in now than where they were in 2019 when the meeting at Hanoi took place. And of course, the smart decision was to not take the ridiculous deal that the North Koreans are putting on the table, but think about where things were in 2018 when Kim Jong Un tried to push that deal and where we might be now in 2025 or beyond. So I think that's the start. But the other really key underlying element is we must be absolutely clear-eyed about the level of mutual support and connection and shared interests between Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong Un. We're not talking about the interest of peoples. We're talking about the interest of people, three specific people who, in my view, are much more aligned than I think is commonly realized or commonly accepted. And so, Dr. Lee, I was very impressed that you used the word alliance to characterize the relationship, for that Kim formed an alliance with Russia, because I think that's the place we're at. Now, as Bruce pointed out, even in the US alliances, right, there's some tension right now, right? Look at NATO, you look at the bilateral alliance relationships of the US, and not even just the US and its allies, but in general, the free world, like-minded countries, don't always see eye to eye on things, right? There's some shared values, there's some shared interests, but at the end of the day, there's not sort of a completely sort of 100% overlap. There's not a complete agreement on every issue, particularly once you start putting the economic things on the table. And so conversely, when we look at the relationship between North Korea, Russia, and China, there's this tendency to focus on the aspects of, well, there's not a whole lot of trust, or there's these divergent interests, and in the end, they'll abandon each other if it's in their best interest. Well, that's how sovereign states behave, right? And particularly that's how I think we need to consider it, is not looking at, hey, what are the potential fractures, what are the potential differences among these three countries, but what are the things that are binding them together, and how likely is it in reality that we are going to be able to negotiate or force a division among these three authoritarian leaders? Instead, my view is that we should focus on aligning ourselves to deal with this reality that Russia, China, and North Korea are more closely aligned than ever. And that, as General Chun mentioned, that North Korea is resolutely nuclear armed and plans to, and is on a pathway to continue to increase its nuclear and non-nuclear military capability. So the focus on diplomacy should be, how do we strengthen deterrence? How do we align in this new environment? How do we transform the alliances to deal with this alliance of adversaries, rather than to expect that we're going to be able to break them? That's my view.
No, that's great. Briefly, Dr. Lee, what is the relationship between Russia and North Korea? Where is it going? And does it matter that Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong Un have a close rapport and good relationship, that they're close? The personal relationship, does that matter? Or is it really just the national interests that Russia and North Korea are pursuing? And you can throw China in as well if you wish, but when they get together on the stage, Putin and Kim, what are they thinking about each other?
It's a very good question. They seem like they like each other very much, especially Putin and actually Russian people appreciate North Korea's contributions very much. Now, before, when I lived in Russia and I observed in Korea, Russia public opinion about North Korea, there's always irony, and that there was some joking about North Korea regime about among the Russian people. But nowadays, when I watch the comments and some articles about North Korea and video clips, many Russian people wrote that we should not forget the sacrifices North Korean soldiers forever. They died for Russia, and I think I can feel that there is kind of a consensus among the Russian bureaucrats and elite and among Russian ordinary people. Now Russia should pay back North Korea, and I heard that in Washington, so there are two groups among the specialists which had a different views, prognosis about the future North Korea and Russia relationship, how it's going to continue, how far it's going to be. In Korea too, there are two groups which had a really different prognosis about the future of two countries. But one group is thinking that Russia will abandon right after the war ends. But another group is thinking that Russia-North Korea relationship will go further quite a long time. The ambassador who I admire the most, Korean ambassador who worked in Russia a very long time, and he served as a diplomat only engaged in Russian affairs about more than 30 years. He told me that the relationship, the Russia-North Korea, is going to be one generation, because the character of relationship has fundamentally changed. Actually, I'm the one of the second group. I really share the opinion of the Ambassador Lee. So we should prepare for the new reality about surrounding the North Korea's environment in foreign affairs.
And so, I mean, President Trump is going to talk to President Putin again very soon.
Yeah,
What would you advise President Trump before he goes to see Putin again, even about the issue of North Korean involvement in Russia, the Russian war? Would you advise him to bring that up and to try to make a deal with Putin on keeping North Korean arms and troops out of Ukraine?
So what I can advise Mr. Trump, for his talks with Trump, I think they will definitely talk about the North Korea issues, including the military troops deployed in the North Korea and Russian territory, and further military cooperation between North Korea and Russia. But I think it requires Trump needs a very good team who can advise Trump in how to manage this situation, in this complicated situation. He has to deal with the Ukraine crisis, and at the same time he has to deal with the North Korean issues. But I think there is a way to find some compromise point with Putin, still, because Putin seeks to find some common interest with Trump. Putin really tried to be liked by Trump. So I think still Trump has opportunity to use Putin's weak position in the Ukraine war.
Interesting. Before we go to the audience for a few questions, Glenn, I wanted to come back and ask whether you think North Korea is able to penetrate my email and steal documents. I don't have classified documents, unlike some former government officials that have been recently indicted.
That you know of.
That I know of. but I mean, seriously, what are North Korea's capabilities in terms of just reaching into American think tanks, into American businesses, into Americans' lives, and taking money, but also taking information?
Yeah, they're quite good. They're one of the two or three or four best organized hacking collectives in the world. It's a criminal state, and it derives its benefits, its money from crime, and most of that crime involves cyber intrusions. And one of the things that keeps me up at night is, and we were talking about this before we came on stage, is you know when you've not clicked on the link, and you know when you've not answered the sketchy email, but you don't know when you have. You don't. And the North Koreans are quite good. They were trained by the Chinese and to a certain degree the Russians. They operate mostly out of northeastern China. There's two main groups of North Koreans. There's the remote IT workers who are in the tens of thousands, possibly more. And then there's a second group whose job is out-and-out larceny, but also degradation, sabotage, denial of service, theft, and ransomware. The groups do overlap. Some of the remote IT workers, when they have been outed, have resorted to ransomware. One of the really bad things about the ubiquity of the remote IT worker problem is these workers have access to administrative level of computer systems, of our private sector computer systems, which of course are not entirely private sector. So if you think about the United States government contracts with companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Google, et cetera, and all of those companies are thoroughly penetrated by the North Koreans, the Chinese, and the Russians. And the North Koreans are maybe not as good as the Chinese or the Israelis, but they're close. And they're capable and they're relentless, and we're not really doing anything about it.
Thank you. Well, we'll be coming back to the cryptocurrency issue. Go ahead, Bruce.
Just to add on the, how pervasive are they against think tankers? When Patrick invited me to participate, I Twitter direct messaged him to say, was this really you? And then subsequently I reached out to Inbum, was this a real event? Because in the last few months, I've had 2 fake overseas trip invitations and an invitation supposedly from a former South Korean government official to participate in a survey, which were fake. And then I even called Korean Air to make sure on the trip that turned out to be real that they had actually purchased a ticket for me. So they are after us, even though we don't have access to classified.
Well, Hanman and I will be coming back and trying to figure out how do we stop the cash out of their cryptocurrency theft, which is a big question, but that's for another day. Right now, we want to take a question or 2 or 3 from the audience. We have time if we collect them. Hanman's standing by with a microphone, so if you'd like to ask a question, just briefly identify yourself. And yes, sir, Grant.
Yeah, hi, I'm Grant Newsham from Center for Security Policy. My question is, after listening to you all, it sounds like North Korea is pretty strong, stronger than I've ever seen it. What are their vulnerabilities?
Good question. All right, well, we'll just go with that one. That's a good question. What are their vulnerabilities? You mentioned information was a fear, but they seem to be very resilient in keeping out information.
But it's not perfect. So again, information is very, very dangerous to a society like North Korea. That's why I think that they invest so much on brainwashing their people. And so far it's working. We see evidence in Ukraine where their soldiers, despite the efforts of Ukrainian special forces trying to capture one alive, they've only been successful in capturing 2. Subsequently, every one of them are killing themselves. And at the last moment, they're not talking about their mothers or the nation, but praising Kim Jong Un and then blowing their heads off. So we should never underestimate the level of political indoctrination that is provided to the North Koreans. But despite this, I wasn't totally joking about K-pop demon hunters. They're so afraid of the casual information that is coming into North Korea that they're taking all measures to protect that kind of information from coming in. We see, I think North Korea realized that Romania, its downfall was because of Chuck Norris. His kung fu movies was allowed by Ceausescu. And when the Romanians were watching these martial arts movies, they also noticed what he was striving with the restaurant, and Kim Jong Un has learned that lesson. So I don't see him, or his Kim family being there for the next 100 years. It's going to collapse. I just hope that it will somehow morph into some rational process than chaos, death, and misery. Because more than anything else, I live right next to them. So they're not Superman. Their time is limited. And he's going to soon learn that he might have nuclear weapons, big nuclear weapons, but he can't eat it. So that's what I think.
Bruce, Marcus, do you want to add anything?
Well, I would just emphasize Inbom's point, but unfortunately both the US and South Korean governments have pulled back on our information warfare, information operations by stopping the broadcast, stopping the agencies that engage in information operations against North Korea. And the South Korean government also seems to be pulling back on its support for North Korean escapees. Economics is another vulnerability, but unfortunately they're less vulnerable now because of all the economic benefits they get from cyber crimes, $1 billion a year or more. They had a single hit of $1.5 billion against a single entity this year. And then also the sanctions have always underachieved. Right now, Russia and China are more obstructionist than the UN Security Council, less likely to enforce sanctions, and successive US administrations, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump, have all not even fully enforced US laws against North Korean and violators and Chinese and Russian facilitators. So again, it's sort of right now, North Korea is at a very strong point because we're underachieving on our sanctions.
Final thoughts?
Yeah, so some good points, but I think we could expand on it more if we had more time. But one that we haven't talked about is the vulnerability posed by the one-man rule system, right? And General Chun alluded to it a little bit. But the importance of the leader of the Kim family in the system and the way that the system is really designed to prevent threats to his rule and even the establishment of a premature establishment of a successor that might make the leader replaceable is a critical vulnerability. He's a human being, and he's only got so much bandwidth, and there's such great reliance on him for decisions. There's such great expectation that he is going to be the font of wisdom and knowledge that it creates this brittleness within the North Korean system, and it means that the North Korean system is only as agile as Kim himself, right? And in particular, the vulnerability, and one that we not necessarily want to exploit, is that if Kim Jong Un leaves the scene, if he's incapacitated, suffers an accident, what have you, that it's not clear if the North Korean system could remain stable after that, right? Who moves in? How does this happen? It's an intentional vulnerability cultivated by the regime system to make it so that the leader is essentially irreplaceable, right? And so this is, on one hand, it's a strength in terms of controlling the system, but it creates a brittleness and a vulnerability, I think, that's underestimated, because our focus has so much been on what what in the last few years has been accomplished in terms of weapons development and these sorts of things. If you were having this conversation, during COVID, or if we were having when North Korea had its lockdowns, or during the famine of the 1990s, then we would be talking about the vulnerabilities of the North Korean system and its potential to collapse, rather than about its opportunity to coerce. And then the last point too is I think there is a vulnerability in that North Korea relies on what is essentially international strategic version of bullying. And so the worst thing you can do to a bully is just call their bluff, right? And not allow yourself to be intimidated. And so North Korea is leveraging its ability to threaten, but as long as we remain strong, develop our capabilities, and have solidarity in our international relationships to counter North Korea, then that really undermines their ability to use that coercion and bullying to achieve their goals.
Anyway, Dr. Lee and Glenn, we have just a minute left. If you want to add another word.
I will take about a minute.
Yeah, I would just say, first of all, I completely agree with my colleagues here, which makes for a not fun panel, I understand. But I would stress the point about money, because money is not just for the nuclear program, it's not just for the missile program, it's for the patronage system that keeps Kim in power. And I contrast the Western response, Western broadly defined, to data and sharing data, to the Western response to Kim's hacking. So you look at the companies in the United States, they will spend hundreds of millions of dollars collectively to comply with GDPR, which is the data rules of the EU. And the reason is the EU will fine domestic, that is European and outside American companies, up to 5% of their annual revenue for violating GDPR. So American companies will hire 50 people to make sure that they comply with GDPR. But on hacking and ransomware and remote IT, they hire nobody. So our incentive system is misaligned. We treat American companies that funnel money to the Kim regime and violate the sanctions as victims. This is a very unpopular thing to say in Silicon Valley, and yet I do it all the time. We have to treat them as perhaps unwitting collaborators. They have to hire the 50 people to make sure that they're not cooperating with Kim and funding the regime.
Yeah, Dr. Lee, let me give you the last word with a very short question for you. If North Korea leadership did fall for whatever reason, if Kim Jong Un is incapacitated, would Russia, and for that matter China, stand aside? Or would they want to ensure that they could control what happens next?
So I think it is a really good question. I think the Syria-Assad case was a good example. I think Kim Jong Un very carefully watched the Syria-Assad case. During the war, because of the war, Russia could save the Assad regime itself, or Syria regime itself, which Putin saved when 2015. But this time Russia failed to do that. But Russia could save the Assad family and evacuate them to Moscow, and even helped Assad to evacuate, to send their money to Moscow. So maybe Kim Jong Un thought that yes, Russia has limited its power to protect its allies, but at least Russia saves his family of his ally. So I think that could be a really good example for Kim Jong Un when he thinks about the further relationship with Russia.
No doubt, that is on his mind. Anyway, we have to end it there. Thank you so much to a great panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists.